They say the frontier makes men, but in truth, it unmakes them first. It strips away the softness, the wasted chatter, the weakness in the bone and blood, until only what is needed remains. Out in the canyon country, where the wind carves the rock sharper than any blade and winter falls without mercy, the land takes hold of a man's soul and remolds it into something hard enough to endure. It was in this place, far from the chatter of saloons and the comfort of fireside company, that Elias Kane lived, alone, forgotten by most, remembered by a few with voices lowered in awe and unease. His cabin stood crooked against the backdrop of snow-dusted pines, no larger than a stagecoach wagon and built of logs darkened with age and smoke. The roof sagged, patched with hides and pine boughs, yet it held firm against the mountain storms. Around it stretched a sweep of wilderness, endless plains where the grass turned brittle in winter, canyons where the echoes of a man's voice seemed swallowed by time itself, and thick woods where wolves roamed like shadows of a darker world. Few dared tread this far. Those who did often left quickly, muttering of the silence that pressed against their ears, a silence heavy with the sense of being watched. Kane thrived in it. He moved like one carved out of the same granite that shaped the cliffs, his shoulders broad beneath a fur-lined coat, his beard streaked with frost, his eyes pale as cold river ice. He spoke little when he wandered into the trading post a half-day's ride south, yet even those brief visits left an impression. He'd set down pelts on the counter, fox, mink, sometimes wolf, and the traders, men who'd seen all kinds of frontiersmen come and go, found themselves uneasy beneath his gaze. Some swore his hands were too scarred, too powerful, as though the sinew in them remembered struggles that no ordinary men could survive. And then there was the story whispered over mugs of bitter coffee and cheap whiskey. Once, years back, Elias Kane had been set upon by a pack of wolves and had killed their leader barehanded, his knife broken, his body half-torn. He had lived. The wolves had not. Folklore has a way of growing in the telling, but when Kane walked into the post, no one laughed at the tale. Men lowered their eyes, muttered greetings, and stepped aside. Women hushed their children. A legend in the flesh can be a terrifying thing. Yet in truth, he sought no reputation. Kane's world was not the gossip of the settlement, nor the fear in men's eyes. His world was the crackle of a fire in deep night, the frozen breath rising from a fresh kill, the feel of snow under boots worn thin. He lived for the rhythm of setting traps in dawn's gray light, of tracking prints through the powder, of skinning and salting hides by lantern glow. The work was endless, grueling, yet in its repetition he found something like peace. Solitude, after all, was a language he spoke better than words. But solitude is a fragile thing on the frontier. No man's quiet lasts forever. That winter was harsh, harsher than most. The rivers froze fast, wolves came down hungry from the ridges, and the trading post saw less of Kane than usual. Rumor drifted through the smoke of the potbelly stove one night, whispered by a rider from the south. Jed Crowley and his gang had been spotted near the old canyon trail. Crowley's name brought a heaviness to the room. He was the kind of outlaw who did not just take, but enjoyed the taking. The burn of fear in men's eyes, the sound of pleading. His crew were cutthroats and killers, drawn to his cruelty the way flies swarm to rot. The traders muttered that Kane, living so far out in the wild, might be in their path if the gang moved north. One man suggested warning him. Another shook his head. "Warn Kane," he said with a dark chuckle. "If Crowley stumbles on him, it ain't Kane we'll be worrying over." The others half smiled, but none quite believed it. An old trapper against a gang of wolves in human skin? The odds seemed poor. Back in his cabin, Kane knew nothing of their whispers. Or perhaps he did. Men like him felt a shift in the wind, the unease that crawled in the bones when violence drew near. He sharpened his knife on a whetstone, slow and steady, the scrape echoing in the stillness. Outside, the night stretched vast, the stars burning cold and indifferent above. Somewhere in the pines, a wolf howled, long and mournful, and Kane paused, listening. He understood that cry better than most. Hunger. Territory. Warning. He thought little of men anymore, for they had little to do with his world. But wolves, those he knew. Wolves he respected. Wolves he had fought, bled against, and in some grim way, loved. To face a wolf was to face the frontier itself, merciless, cunning, relentless. It was why the story of him breaking one with his bare hands had stuck. There was something in his bearing, in the slow, deliberate way he moved, that made people believe it. As the fire crackled low and shadows danced against the rough-hewn walls, Kane leaned back, listening to the silence. It was the kind of silence that pressed in too close, broken only by the occasional groan of the wood or the crack of distant ice. The land was watching. The land was waiting. He closed his eyes and felt it like a storm building beyond the horizon. In the morning, he set out as he always did, trap slung across his shoulder, rifle strapped to his back. The snow was knee-deep in places, glittering under a sun too pale to bring warmth. His breath rose like smoke, his boots crunching steady through the drifts. Every sound carried sharp in the air, the flap of a raven's wing, the snap of a branch. He moved with purpose, but also with caution. Men who survived this long in the wilderness did nothing carelessly. By noon, he had set a line of steel jaws near the creek and was working his way toward the ridge when he found tracks not belonging to wolf or deer. Hoofprints. Fresh. More than one horse. The rhythm of their gait told him they were not riders from the post. Those men rode steady and slow. These prints showed haste. Chase, perhaps. Or flight. He crouched, running calloused fingers through the snow, reading the story left behind. 4, maybe 5 men. Armed, by the way the horses staggered heavy underweight. His jaw tightened. He had no need for their kind near his land. Still, he turned back toward his cabin as dusk approached, the sky bleeding crimson against the canyon rim. By the time the smoke rose once more from his chimney, Cain had already decided what must be done. Trouble was coming. Whether it found him or not, he could not say. But the wind carried with it a bitterness, and Cain knew from long experience that when the wolves of men came howling, they were far crueler than any beast with fangs. He stoked the fire higher, the light painting his face in flickering gold and shadow. In his eyes there was no fear, no hesitation, only the quiet acceptance of a man who had survived too long to bow to any gang. Out there in the wilderness, darkness deepened, and the outlaw gang moved like carrion crows toward the lonely trapper's domain. The land had shaped Cain into something harder than steel, and soon, men would learn what the wilderness already knew. Elias Cain was not prey. He was the storm that hunted in silence, waiting for the foolish to stumble too close. The canyon wind carried the sound of hooves before the riders appeared, a steady thunder rolling across the frozen earth. Snow scattered beneath iron shoes, breath steaming from weary horses, and the silhouettes of 6 men cut sharp against the paling sky. They rode hard, as men do when law or death snaps at their heels, their eyes sharp with suspicion, their mouths curled in hunger and impatience. At their head sat Jed Crowley, a man whose reputation preceded him like the stench of rot. Broad-shouldered, with a black hat pulled low over cold eyes, Crowley had carved his place in the outlaw world not through speed or charm, but through cruelty so pure it seemed born of the land itself. Behind him rode his pack. Silas Mott, the scarred gunslinger with a mouthful of gold teeth, always grinning as if death itself amused him. Boone, the lanky tracker with eyes like a hawk's, whose silence was more unsettling than words. Young Caleb, hardly more than a boy, eager to prove himself, his innocence already drowned in the blood of those unlucky enough to cross his path. 2 more rode in their shadow, Harlan, heavyset and slow to thought but quick to violence, and Deke, wiry, sharp as a rattler, with a laugh that grated like steel on stone. Together they were less a gang and more a swarm of jackals, loyal only to the scent of spoils. They had left a trail of fire behind them. The stagecoach they had robbed 2 days earlier still smoked in the desert, its passengers buried shallow beneath frozen soil. The law was on their heels, though the wild country gave them cover. All they needed was a place to rest, to fill their bellies, to regroup before the next strike. When Boone raised a hand, the others reined in, their horses snorting in the snow. He pointed toward a thin ribbon of smoke curling into the sky from the trees ahead. Crowley's eyes narrowed, his grin slow to spread. "Looks like luck's with us, boys," he drawled. "Cabin smoke. Some lonely farmer or trapper. We'll take his food, his fire, maybe his mule if he's got one." Caleb shifted in the saddle, nervous but eager. "What if he don't share, Jed?" Crowley spat into the snow. "Then he won't need his teeth to chew, will he?" The men laughed, except Boone, whose gaze lingered on the smoke as though measuring something none of the others could see. But he said nothing, and Crowley kicked his horse forward, the gang following with the hunger of vultures circling a carcass. The cabin emerged from the trees like a ghost, its rough logs half buried in snow, its roof patched and heavy with ice. No barn, no livestock pen, just a house crouched against the wilderness, stubborn in its loneliness. Smoke drifted from the crooked chimney, and the faint glow of firelight flickered through a narrow window. Crowley swung from the saddle and stomped toward the door, boots crunching loud in the silence. He didn't knock. His fist slammed against the wood once, twice, before he shoved it open and strode inside, revolver loose in his hand. The moon within did not startle. He sat by the fire, sharpening a knife with a slow, steady rasp, as though a pack of wolves had not just forced their way into his den. His hair was iron gray, his face weathered by years of wind and frost, his frame thick with the muscle of hard labor. His eyes, pale as winter, lifted briefly to the intruders, then returned to the blade in his hands. "Well, well," Crowley sneered, spreading his arms as if to claim the room. "What do we have here? A hemet. A trapper." He sniffed. "Smells like pelts and smoke in here. You alone, old man?" Elias Kane did not answer. He slid the blade along the stone, the sound hissing through the silence. The gang spilled in behind Crowley, boots thudding on the plank floor, voices jeering. Silas leaned close, flashing his gold teeth. "Look at him, Jed. Old Coyote thinks he don't need words." Caleb shuffled nervously, glancing at the rifle propped by the door. Harlan snatched it up, chuckling as though disarming the mun was some grand victory. Kane didn't flinch. He set the knife down, slow as a man setting aside a thought. Crowley swaggered closer, revolver dangling loose in his grip. "We'll make this simple, Grandpa. We need food. We need whiskey, if you got it. Maybe some blankets. And you're gonna give it, because 6 of us and 1 of you don't leave much room for argument." The fire popped. Shadows danced across Kane's face, carving the lines deeper, harder. He looked at Crowley then, meeting his gaze full on. For a heartbeat, the air shifted. Something raw and ancient flickered in those pale eyes, a glint that made Caleb swallow hard and Silas's grin falter. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by silence so heavy it pressed against their ears. Crowley chuckled, but it rang a touch hollow. "Cat got your tongue, old man." He leaned close enough to smell the smoke in Kane's beard. "Or maybe you think you're better than us. That it?" Still Kane said nothing. His calm was unnerving, a stillness that wasn't fear, wasn't submission. It was the patience of something waiting, watching, measuring the odds. Boone shifted in the corner, eyes narrowing as though he recognized the scent of danger but couldn't name it. Harlan began rummaging through a cupboard, tossing dried meat and beans onto the table. Deke uncorked a jug and swigged, spilling whiskey down his chin. Caleb shuffled closer to the fire, the warmth on his young face battling the chill of unease in his gut. Silas hovered, itching for Kane to move, to speak, to break the silence so he could laugh again. But Kane didn't. He leaned back in his chair, arms resting loose on the worn wood, as though 6 armed outlaws were nothing more than passing weather. The knife lay on the table, gleaming faint in the firelight. His hands, scarred and broad, tapped once against the wood. The sound was soft, but it carried a slow heartbeat in the tense room. Crowley finally straightened, holstering his revolver with exaggerated ease. "You'll do fine, old man. Feed us, keep quiet, and we'll leave you breathing come morning." He smirked, turning to his men. "Ain't that right, boys? No need to waste lead on a scarecrow." Laughter filled the cabin again, rough and sharp, but none of it seemed to touch Kane. His gaze had gone distant, as though listening to some call beyond the walls. Outside, the wind howled low through the pines, carrying the faint, mournful echo of wolves. Boone glanced toward the window, uneasy. "Jed," he muttered, "something ain't right about him." Crowley waved him off. "He's a relic. Alone too long, half-feral. What's he gonna do? Scowl us to death?" But Boone didn't answer. He was watching Kane, really watching, and for the first time in years, the tracker felt the stare of a memory, the way wild animals went still before they struck, the silence before teeth sank into flesh. Kane's lips curved then, not into a smile, not quite. Just the barest shift, like the twitch of a wolf's muzzle before a lunge. And in that moment, though the outlaws laughed and drank, though Crowley puffed his chest, though Caleb tried to hide the shiver in his bones, the truth hung in the room unspoken. This was no helpless old man. This was a predator biding his time. Snow fell harder by nightfall, fat flakes swirling in the wind, muffling the sound of hooves as the gang tethered their horses outside the cabin. The storm had come quick, smothering the forest in white, and the men grew restless in the flickering firelight. Kane sat bound in the corner, wrists tied behind the chair, his face bruised from Silas's heavy fists, blood drying on his lip. Still, his eyes burned steady, cold as river ice, watching each of them as though weighing their bones. Crowley paced before him, boots thudding, pistol loose in his hand. You've got a mouth made for silence, Oldman, he drawled. Maybe we'll loosen it. Teach you how to talk respectful. He nodded at Silas, who cracked his knuckles with relish. The first blow landed hard, snapping Kane's head to the side. Another followed, the room echoing with dull thuds, laughter, and the scrape of boots shifting for a better view. Caleb lingered in the background, pale beneath the fire's glow, his hand twitching near the handle of his revolver but never drawing. "Jed," Boone muttered, watching Kane's stillness. "He ain't fighting back." "That's the point," Crowley snarled. "We remind him what happens when folks don't show proper gratitude." Another strike, then another. Kane's chair creaked, but he did not fall. His breath came slow, steady. He spat blood onto the floor and looked up, eyes locking with Crowley's. No fear. No plea. Only a silent promise that made Crowley's grin falter for just a heartbeat. "Leave him," Crowley barked at last, shoving Silas aside. "Tie him outside. Let the cold finish what we started." Harlan and Deke dragged Kane through the door, rope biting deep into his wrists, boots scraping across the frozen earth. They lashed him to a pine, snow already clinging to his hair and shoulders, then stomped back inside, laughing. The door slammed shut, and the storm swallowed the sound. The cold hit Kane like a wall, searing through flesh, sinking into bone. Frost gnawed at his fingers, his breath pluming white in the night. But he did not panic. His heart beat steady, his mind sharpening with the cold. The forest was not his enemy. It was his oldest companion. He listened. The groan of pines swaying under snow. The distant crack of ice shifting. And then, faint and low, the long mournful howl of wolves drifting through the canyon. Kane tested the rope, twisting his wrists, letting pain grind against old scars. The fibers stretched, just barely, but enough to give him hope. He shifted his weight, slow and deliberate, sawing the cords against the rough bark until strands frayed. The wolves howled again, closer now. He felt them in his blood, in the rhythm of his pulse, as if they called not to the forest but to him. At last the rope gave. Kane slipped free, flexing his stiffened fingers, breath ragged. He crouched low, melting into the shadows of the trees, snow swallowing his tracks as if the land itself wished to conceal him. Behind him, the cabin glowed with firelight, the gang's laughter muffled through the storm. They thought him finished. They thought wrong. Inside, tempers frayed. Boone leaned against the wall, eyes darting to the window. "Storm's bad," he muttered. "Tracks'll be buried. Law won't follow in this weather." "Good," Crowley said, lifting a tin cup of whiskey. "Then we got time to rest." But Silas scowled, restless. "That old bastard's eyes," he spat. "Didn't like him. Didn't like the way he just sat there." "He's tied to a tree," Crowley snapped. "Ain't nothing to fret over." Boone's gaze lingered on the flames, his voice low. "You ever seen an animal play dead? Makes you think it's beat, till it's on your throat." The others laughed, but unease crackled like static in the air. Caleb sat apart, staring at the door, hearing the wind howl like voices on the edge of madness. Out in the forest, Kane moved soundless, every step chosen with care. He knew the land, every hollow and rise, every place a man could vanish. His traps, set along the ridge earlier, waited like iron jaws in the snow. He armed himself with what the wilderness gave, a length of sharpened branch, stones for distraction, and the patience of a predator. He circled wide, until the cabin loomed before him once more, its firelit windows glowing against the storm. He crouched low, listening. Through the walls came the muffled argument of outlaws whose confidence cracked beneath the weight of the night. Kane closed his eyes, drew in the cold air, and let out a low, guttural sound, a wolf's call, long and hollow, echoing across the trees. The cabin fell silent. Inside, the men froze, whiskey halfway to their lips. Hell was that? Deke muttered. "Just wolves," Crowley scoffed. "Ain't you heard a wolf before?" But Boone's face had gone pale. "Not like that," he whispered. The howl came again, closer this time. Then another, answering from deeper in the canyon. The gang shifted uneasily, hands moving to pistols, eyes flicking to the windows. Caleb's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Outside, Kane slipped through the shadows, placing stones where snow would shift, branches where they'd snap underfoot. He moved with the storm, with the wolves, his silence broken only by the steady beat of his heart. He was no longer a man bound to a tree. He was the wilderness itself, hunting the intruders who thought him prey. The first trap sprang before midnight. A scream tore from the darkness as Harlan stumbled outside to piss. His leg caught in steel jaws Cain had set hours earlier. The others rushed to the door, weapons drawn, only to see their companion writhing in the snow, the iron biting deep. From the trees came another howl, closer, sharper, like laughter in the night. "Goddamn wolves!" Silas shouted, firing blindly into the dark. The bullet sparked off stone, vanished into snow. No cry followed, only silence, heavier than before. Crowley cursed, dragging Harlan back inside, blood trailing across the threshold. He slammed the door shut, eyes darting to the shadows beyond. For the first time, he saw doubt in his men's faces. Boone spoke low, voice rough. "It ain't wolves. It's him. That old man." Crowley snarled, though unease threaded his tone. Boone's gaze cut to the window. "You saw his eyes. That weren't no man ready to die." The fire burned lower, shadows deepening. The storm howled through the pines, the wolves answering in chorus. Every sound seemed magnified, the creak of the logs, the groan of the wind, the crackle of the fire. Sleep would not come for any of them. Cain waited, patient as stone, until the fire's glow dimmed and the gang's nerves frayed to snapping. Then he struck again. A branch thrown hard against the back wall sent them scrambling, pistols blazing at shadows. Another howl rose behind them, answered by a chorus on the ridge. Panic set in, sharp and hot. Silas snarled, shoving Caleb toward the door. "Go see what's out there, boy." Caleb's eyes widened, his hands trembling. "No. I. Do it." The boy stumbled into the storm, revolver clutched tight, his breath ragged clouds in the night. The forest pressed in around him, silent save for the whisper of snow falling through the pines. He turned, spinning at every shadow, every crack of ice. Then a shape rose from the ground, silent, sudden, all fury and strength. Caleb screamed once before Cain's hand clamped over his mouth, dragging him into the trees. The boy vanished without a sound, leaving only his revolver in the snow. Inside, the gang waited. The scream came faint, then silence. Boone's face hardened. "He's picking us off." Crowley's jaw clenched. "No hermit's gonna scare me off my bed. We hold till morning, then ride. He can't kill us all." But even Crowley's voice had lost its swagger, drowned by the knowledge gnawing at each of them. The trapper was no victim. He was the storm itself, moving with the wolves, striking with the patience of a predator. And out in the wilderness, Elias Cain crouched in the snow, eyes glowing in the firelight's edge, heart steady as the land itself. The night was his. By the time dawn threatened the horizon, the cabin had become a cage of fear. The storm had thinned, leaving only the bitter cold and the long shadows of the pines stretching like claws across the snow. Inside, the gang's bravado had withered to whispers, every creak of timber making them flinch, every gust of wind dragging their nerves tighter. Harlan groaned on the floor, his leg mangled from the trap, feverish and pale. Caleb was gone. Boone sat silent, watching the door, while Silas paced like a caged animal, his gold-toothed grin long since vanished. Crowley's jaw worked as he studied his men. He could feel it, the noose tightening. Whoever Cain was, whatever he was, he had turned the wilderness into a weapon, and Crowley hated him for it. The silence broke with a scream outside, sharp and ragged, then cut short. Deke had gone to fetch wood moments earlier. Now only the sound of crunching snow drifted back, deliberate, slow, and far too close. Silas rushed to the window, eyes darting into the gloom. "I don't see him." The glass shattered. A length of sharpened wood speared through, catching Silas across the cheek, tearing skin. He stumbled back, cursing, blood running hot down his jaw. Boone fired blindly through the window, the gunshot echoing into emptiness. "Enough!" Crowley roared, rage masking the tremor in his voice. He kicked open the door, revolver raised, snow swirling around him. "Show yourself, you bastard!" The forest answered with silence, then the long, hollow call of a wolf. It rose from the canyon, mournful and commanding, and was joined by others in the distance. The gang shivered, guns twitching, but Crowley sneered. "He thinks he's got us scared with animal tricks. He's just a man." But Boone's eyes were wide, his voice low and certain. "No, he's more than that." The snow shifted. Deke's body tumbled into view, throat slit clean, his eyes staring glassy into nothing. The men froze. From the tree line, Cain emerged, slow, deliberate, like a shadow made flesh. His coat hung torn, his beard frosted, but his eyes burned bright, cold fire gleaming in their depths. He carried no rifle, no pistol, only a knife glinting faint in the morning light. Crowley raised his revolver. "You're a dead man." Cain did not flinch. His voice, when it came, was gravel pulled from the depths of the earth. "You think you're wolves, but you've never faced one." Silas barked a laugh, though it shook. "You call yourself a wolf, old man." Cain's gaze flicked to him, steady and unblinking. "Years ago," he said, each word measured, "I walked into a pack's den. Snow up to my waist, blood in the air. They came at me, 7 of them. I killed their leader with my bare hands, tore the life from him while the rest circled. They say a man can't beat a wolf without steel. They never saw me." The words landed heavy, hanging in the frozen air. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if listening. Boone swallowed, his knuckles white on his rifle. Silas shifted, unease clawing at him. Crowley spat. "Fairy tales. You're just a hermit who's lost his mind." But even as he said it, he saw the scars etched deep across Cain's hands, the ragged lines along his throat. He saw the truth written on the man's skin, on the steadiness of his stance, on the hunger in his pale eyes. Then Cain moved. He lunged low, swift as a striking wolf, snow spraying under his boots. Silas fired, but too slow. Cain slammed into him, knife flashing once, twice. Silas collapsed into the snow, his laughter silenced forever, his golden teeth glinting as blood spilled dark across the white. Chaos erupted. Boone shouted, firing into the storm of movement, but Cain was gone into the trees, only to reappear behind him, striking with brutal precision. Boone dropped to his knees, gurgling, hands clutching at the blade in his side. Inside the cabin, Harlan groaned weakly, too broken to rise. Crowley stood alone now, revolver trembling in his grip, his breath steaming ragged. The forest was silent again, save for the faint crunch of Cain's boots drawing closer. Crowley stepped into the snow, fury and fear wrestling in his chest. "You think you scare me? You're just a man. I've killed lawmen, soldiers, families. You bleed like the rest." Cain emerged from the trees, knife in hand, shoulders squared. His voice was calm, almost sorrowful. "I don't bleed like the rest." Crowley fired. The shot cracked through the air, but Cain had already moved, diving into the snow, rolling low. Another shot rang, splintering bark. Then Cain was on him, knocking the revolver aside, the 2 men crashing into the snow with the weight of beasts colliding. They grappled, raw and brutal, fists and knives clashing, breath grunts tearing from their throats. Crowley was strong, fueled by rage, but Cain was relentless, every strike calculated, every movement honed by years of survival. He fought with the ferocity of a predator, silent and merciless, his knife flashing like fangs. Crowley managed a blow to Cain's jaw, staggering him back. He lunged, knife slashing, but Cain caught his wrist, twisted, and with a surge of strength born from years of wrestling wolves in winter, drove the blade into Crowley's chest. Crowley gasped, blood spilling from his lips, eyes wide with disbelief. Cain held him close, their breath mingling in the cold. "You thought I was prey," he whispered. "You were wrong." Crowley's body sagged, his strength pouring into the snow. Cain released him, letting him fall, the red blooming across the white like fire on ice. The forest grew still. The wolves howled again, long and low, as though mourning or honoring the fallen. Cain stood over the bodies, chest heaving, knife dripping, his shadow long in the dawnlight. He was no hermit, no forgotten trapper. He was the storm, the predator, the legend carved into the bones of the frontier. And those who had dared to test him had learned too late. Elias Cain was not a man to be hunted. He was the hunter, and the wilderness would remember his name long after their bones turned to dust beneath the snow. The dawn broke pale and unforgiving, its first light spilling across the snow like a shroud. Smoke no longer rose from the cabin. The fire inside had died with its occupants. The world was hushed, save for the crunch of boots as Elias Cain moved through the aftermath. His breath came ragged, each inhale sharp with the taste of iron, each exhale drifting white into the brittle air. Blood darkened the snow in wide, ugly patches, and the bodies of the Crowley gang lay scattered like broken shadows against the whiteness. Cain stood in the center of it all, battered, his coat torn, his hands raw with fresh wounds layered atop old scars. He did not shake. He did not smile. His eyes, pale as winter, scanned the quiet with the detached calm of a man long accustomed to survival. Above, the wolves sang, their mournful howls weaving through the trees, not as threats but as something older, stranger, respect, perhaps, or kinship. One by one, he dragged the dead into the frozen earth. The work was grueling, his breath hissing with effort, but he gave each outlaw a grave all the same. No markers, no prayers, only the finality of cold soil covering cold flesh. When the last mound was pressed flat, Cain leaned on his shovel, staring at the line of graves with no triumph in his heart. He had never sought to be executioner or savior. The wild had chosen him as it always did, without mercy. Back at the cabin, he tended his wounds by firelight, dabbing whiskey into torn flesh, binding cuts with strips of cloth. His face remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed the weight of solitude settling once more upon him. He had stared down death and won, yet there was no glory in it. Just the silence of the wilderness, pressing in eternal, reminding him that tomorrow would bring more snow, more traps to set, more nights alone. In the weeks that followed, word of the Crowley gang's disappearance spread like fire through the frontier towns. Some claimed the law had caught them, others whispered darker things, that the wild itself had risen against them, led by a ghost who lived among wolves. And when tongues wagged long enough, a name surfaced, spoken with reverence and unease, Elias Cain. The trapper who could not be broken, the man who had turned the wilderness into his weapon. Legends are born not in saloons or courts, but in blood and silence. Cain never sought his. He lived on in the shadow of the pines, the graves buried deep, the storm forever at his back. And so the story ended as it began, in whispers. Some men live by the law, some by the gun, but Elias Cain lived by the wild, and the wild remembered him.